Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. Imagine being able to sit in front of any synth, hardware or software and know exactly how to navigate your way around to start making sounds. Well, in today's live stream, I'm going to show you step by step where to begin. Mastering the basics of synthesis so you can create your own sounds from scratch. This is one of those key skills that will set you free from relying on presets and help you develop your own unique sound. We'll break down the key components of a synth and explore different types of synthesis available inside of Ableton Live, because in the end, why spend hours searching for that perfect sound when you can make it yourself? So feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat. We'll hang out, have fun, discover new things along the way. And as always, my goal is to help you become a better music producer. So without further ado, let's dive in. Let's maybe start with a few little tests just to make sure that everything's working as it should be. So let's begin with hopefully the microphone. Chavi dias, muy buenas tardes, good afternoon. Hope you're doing well, my friend. Hope it's not too cold in Suecia and everything's well with you. Good to see you here. By the way, if you're also here alongside Chavi Diaz, do say hello. There's a nice vibe generally in the chat, so say hello to each other, say hello to me. Got any questions, don't be shy, ask away. Obviously try and keep it related to Ableton Live and production. Anyway, let's have a quick test of some audio here. So the meters look like they're running all pretty good there. So I believe we have audio. Again, if anyone wishes to confirm that, that would be great. Just a thumbs up or let me know. But I think those tests are over on that side of it. So let's then begin with kind of a few points here. So let's start with what is the main criteria defining. So by the way, today is going to be a little bit of a teaching type episode, so hopefully if you're in the classroom, great. It's going to be sort of, we'll be making some music, but we'll definitely be sort of digging into the nuts and bolts of this, because to me, synthesis and learning how to, as I said, navigate your way around a synthesizer, I would rank it in my top three, for sure, points that will like a key that will unlock finding and making your own unique sounds. That kind of music that you really wish to make. Well, learning synthesis and being comfortable with it is one of those keys, and top three keys that can make you make a lot of progress in that direction. So two main criteria to define a musical instrument as a synth: it must produce its basic sound via electronic or digital means. So even electronic mechanical devices that produce their sound mechanically or acoustically and amplified, such as organs or electric pianos, they do not count. It also must give the user significant control in shaping or modifying the sound being produced beyond basic EQ or effects. So we're going to look at sort of what kind of sounds we can create or recreate using synthesis. What are some of the limitations of it? And yeah, sort of deep dive into it. So let's begin a little bit by having a look at, prepared a few little screen slides as well. So let's maybe start with this one. So hopefully you can see that on the screen pop up in a moment. Now that's going to be showing you essentially the building blocks of a synthesizer and a type of synthesis called subtractive synthesis. And that is kind of like, again, the building blocks of synthesizers and synthesis. The term subtractive synthesis, this is a type of synthesis. And if we look at this image on the screen, these are the kind of building blocks that we're going to be looking into a bit today: oscillators, filters, amplifiers, maybe In part 2 or the second hour today, we might look at a bit of modulation to them, but we're just, as I said, we're going to start with the very basics and wrap our head around those. And we can include in that little image there that isn't in that picture, envelopes. And that's one that is a real stumbling block for many, many people. Thanks, Chavidias, for confirming we're all good with the sound. So yes, we're going to be looking at that. We're also, let's jump to just another slide here. And this is a slide I've put together here a little bit to help understand a little bit what we kind of have in our locker when we're Ableton Live users, right? And essentially, if you're in the 12, there isn't too much difference here. If you're not in 12, so you're in 11 or an earlier version, you're not going to have meld. You're not going to have granulator 3, but you would have access to granulator 2 in 11, and probably I think even 10 there was a version of granulator, but meld is new in 12, and the granulator 3 edition is new in 12. But knowing these synths and what types of sounds they can produce, and them being in a locker is a really good thing also to understand. I think of the synths, the VSTs I have, all of the Ableton ones, some extra third-party ones I have, they're kind of like, to me, a rack of guitars in the studio that I can just go and pick up that guitar, and I have that Gibson or that Stratocaster because of the sound that it produces, and that differentiates it from something else. So I've put underneath each synth what it kind of is capable of, and a few little tips and pointers there. But if we just briefly go over it, we can do subtractive synth quite comfortably with various synths that we have in our locker in Ableton. We can do FM synthesis, we can do wavetable synthesis, we can do granular synthesis, bitimbral synthesis, additive synthesis, and physical modeling. And that pretty much covers a huge range of different types of synthesis. So in all honesty, Ableton provides us with a lot of excellent tools. What I will do is I'll make this a PDF, a free PDF, a little chart, and I'll stick a link down in the description. And you can grab yourself a copy of this if you like and stick it somewhere in your desktop. And if you're ever unsure of which synth to pull out of that locker and what it might be basically capable of, well, this should help point you in the right direction. All right, so we're going to jump back now to Ableton itself. All right, I'm going to get rid of that screen out the way. And then we're going to start a little bit with some synthesizers. Could be a good place to start. And we also might do a little bit of another project as well, actually. Let's see if we can combine these. This could be quite helpful, I think, as well to take a look at. So we might just take out some components from inside of this project here. It's called Understanding Envelopes and Timbre. Hopefully some of you have heard of that word before, timbre. Anyone know what timbre is? Do you want to drop that in the chat there if you know what timbre is? Looks like timber, but we say timbre in English. All right, so drop those into there. We don't need that extra audio track there. And then on these MIDI tracks, let's start out of the instrument folder with one of those synthesizers from Ableton Live, the analog. Drop that on a MIDI track. And then what we're going to do today, we're going to break a little bit out of Ableton's instruments as well for a second into a bit of third party, because for those of you who are visual learners, I want to kind of help you out today, because that is one thing that with Ableton Live synths, they all sound amazing. They all do these different types of synthesis and they do it very well. But GUI wise, you know, there are obviously other synths on the market such as Serum and the one we're going to use today, Arturia Pigments, that do actually give you a lot of great visual help. And I think that can be a useful thing for some of you, as I said, who are visual learners. So let's grab ourselves an instance of Pigments as well, which, by the way, I think is an amazing synth, often on sale, particularly this time of year. It's one of those sort of synths that again, if we just looked at that chart that I made of Ableton and all the different types of synthesis you can do inside of Ableton Live, well, Pigments itself is extremely versatile. It has 2 engines. It can do wavetable. It can do traditional analog sounds. You can do sampling in here. You can also have a harmonic oscillators. It's a powerful device. What I love about it, the reason for showing it today, is what goes on down here, where we get a visual representation of things like envelopes, which can be really, really helpful, I think, to kind of wrap your head around what envelopes do, which is definitely a strong part of today. All right, so pigments, what we're going to do with our pigments is we are going to go in and we're not going to have any presets or anything. We are going to strip it right back to the default. So there's nothing set up in there because we're going to be using it from scratch. So let's put pigments down for a second and we'll go over to analog and we'll take a little look around at the analog device, right? So where we start, if we go back to that slide that I showed a moment ago, oscillators, filters, amps, envelopes. This is where we sort of start, and also a great place to start, even though there is all those different types of synthesis, is with subtractive. That's kind of how synthesis evolved. It evolved as this subtractive synth that then evolved in all these different directions. Analog, perfect example of a subtractive synth. It doesn't really do anything else. That's what it does. So we're going to straight away turn off oscillator 2 down the bottom here, okay? And we're just going to treat it as a one oscillator synth for now. We're going to keep it super simple, right? We're also going to grab a little tool here that I created before, a little rack. So I'm just going to drag that over, put it behind both the analog and the pigments. And essentially this rack's just going to help us see a few things like what's going on frequency-wise when we kind of make a sound. So the spectrum of frequency. And we're also going to take a look a little bit at something like the wave shape as well. So the waveform, right? So if you need any links to these things, do let me know. Oscilloscopes, this is quite a free Max for Live one that is quite a useful one, and as you can see you can actually expand it. So I also like this one, but this is a docked oscilloscope, so we're only going to see it down here in the clip view down the bottom, whereas this particular one here, as you can see, you can expand it, which is quite nice, and actually resize it quite a bit as well from memory. So you can, I think you can resize it, yeah, up here, so you can plus and minus, so you can make it really big. Those kind of tools can be really useful to see what you're generating, right? So if we come back over to analog, let's open up a piano roll here, just make sure we're getting some MIDI and we're getting a C. So what we want is a C3 ideally down here. So let's just arm the right track, let's arm the analog track. There we go. So we see we're triggering a C3, that's good. I just want to kind of like keep my note for the moment pretty consistent so that we're not going to, have too much confusion about different MIDI notes and things for now. We're just going to keep our pitch very, very simple, a C3. So let's open up the tools on this track, would help. So let's put that back up there. By the way, if I do end up putting anything in the way of a webcam, please do let me know. But I kind of believe I'm over here face-wise, made a few changes there. Hopefully it shouldn't get in the way. Okay, so Vox and Go span down here. That over there. So if we play C now on our analog, we can see two things. We've got a waveform up here, and down here we've got our frequency that we're generating, right? So the first big tip here, and it's a really important one when it comes to oscillators. And if I describe an oscillator, so I'm looking at my notes here, this is the technical side, but we're going to break it down practically as well. What is an oscillator? An oscillator is an electronic component that causes electrons to move back and forth or oscillate. These movements are very similar to the way that air molecules move around when they're in contact with a vibrating object. Just as a guitar string vibrates or wiggles air molecules around it, an oscillator wiggles electrons and makes a sound. And you've got to remember that we're in VST world here, but in a lot of the hardware synths, that's all happening with electricity and voltage, but the same concept, right? They're totally the same. So we're dealing with oscillations and vibrations. What is the oscillator? Well, it's the tone generator. right? It's the part of the synth that's going to give us our first building block, and that's the tone. And right now we've put analog into one oscillator only, and we've got a sawtooth in the shape box here, and these are the 4 shapes that we have available, the 4 waveforms: sine wave, sawtooth, square wave, and noise, right? And once again, that takes us right back to the beginning of synthesis. Those were the waveforms and building blocks of synthesis since pretty much day dot, right? So big tip, let's start with a sine wave in here. If I have a sine wave, and we now look at these meters that we have here, both our oscilloscope and our Vox and Go span, if I play my C3, you can see that all I'm generating here is the fundamental harmonic of the note I'm playing, and I have a very clean, pure waveform, right? So that's what the sine wave delivers, right? It delivers a pure waveform, clean, and just one fundamental harmonic. Maybe we should talk about that for a very quick second. What is a harmonic? Well, that's the next thing. Harmonics are low volume, high frequency vibrations that exist in any sound which generates that sound's characteristic tone, color, or timbre. Remember that word again? Timbre. Any sound that is made is usually made up of lots of vibrations. Even something as simple as a plucked guitar string, again, is made up of an infinite amount of vibrations other than the one we hear as the note itself. So harmonics are going to be really important here, and they're generated by that oscillator, right? So again, we could see with the sine wave, we don't really have any harmonics. We just have the fundamental note and a clean waveform. If we change that to the sawtooth, well, we get quite a difference, right? So we're getting our fundamental again, but now we're getting lots and lots of harmonics, a series of harmonics as they're called, odd and even as they're called, overtones as they're called. And you can see our waveforms changed as well. Now if we go over here and we grab ourselves a square wave, similarly, we've got, again, more harmonics, fundamental plus harmonics. And if we actually sort of ping pong, what I want you to look at a little bit is I'll keep the note held and I'll change the shape. Watch sort of which harmonics kind of disappear when we go back to the sawtooth. So you can see sawtooth, what it actually has in the sawtooth is a quite an even balance of what's called odd and even harmonics, right? But if we look at the square wave, sorry, you can see it kind of boosts what are actually the odd harmonics and a lot less of the even, and that's what gives it that kind of nasally kind of tone to it. And I think the most obvious sounding oscillator here, or waveform, is the noise, right? And that's not, again, it's one of our building blocks, but it's not the straight up tone generator that we're probably going to make a lot of sounds from as the first building block, but it could be great to layer with other building blocks, right? Unless you're making hi-hats or things like that, or noise risers or stuff like that, then you may start with a noise waveform first. So what is the big tip about sine waves? Really important one, right? When it comes to understanding synthesis. So we know that the sine wave doesn't generate harmonics. We're dealing at the moment with breaking this down, and we're breaking down the technique or the type of synthesis called subtractive synthesis. So a lot of people use sine waves, but what they don't understand about it is that essentially the next step that we might perhaps do here in a subtractive synth is we kind of want, if you think about the name itself, we're kind of building up something that we're then subtracting from. And so if you're looking at a sine wave, there's nothing to subtract. And so if you have a filter, which we do on the analog, it's the next section along here at the top. So if you click in the analog in these sections, we're going through the 3 different building blocks essentially of subtractive synthesis. This is our oscillator on the left here. In the middle we have a filter, and on the right we have an amp envelope, or our amplitude section. So if we look at a filter, we've got a built-in filter here that's currently low passing, all right, or sorry, high. It's a low pass filter, but it's going to cut the highs away. And if I play my C3, this filter, you might as well switch it off, right? Because all we're going to achieve with that filter right now, let's sweep it down, watch the note over here. And that's all you're going to do. All you're going to do is turn that note down, nothing more. So the first thing we should learn about subtractive synthesis is that we're trying to have harmonics here. We want a wall of sound, some sound, character that we can carve into and create sounds from that. So big tip for you, sine wave with a filter. It doesn't matter if it's analog, any synths, waste of time unless you're adding effects that are going to give it harmonics, which we could also do. We're going to look at just the synth today, but if we added effects after the synth, we could have that sine wave plus. Well, let me just quickly show you what I mean by that. So if we sort of go over and we grab something that's going to give us a little bit of color, so we could very easily get something like the amp could be good, actually, right at the top here. So if we put an amp here and then we hold our C3, we still don't get anything just yet. Let me just make sure. So there you go. So just changing the type, that was on clean. You now see we've generated harmonics. Now the filter in the synth isn't helpful here either, because again, it's just turning down the fundamental. But if we were to put a filter from Ableton after, so we don't use, again, we just switch off the synths filter, but we use this filter, we'd now be able to carve into that. Now you do notice there's a little bit of volume in the filter here, so we can leave it switched on. But that would now make sense, what's going on here, right? So we built harmonics post the synth using an amp and a filter that we can then shape. So I wanted to point that out because, as I said, a lot of people make a big mistake with that. They're working with sine waves and there's really no harmonics at all. Hi, Gerosphere, how you doing? Thanks for saying hello. Also, if there are others of you in the stream, do say hello. Do drop any questions in the chat. Hope you're enjoying so far. As I said, there's a fair bit of talking today, but I'm just, pointing you in the right direction of how you can make your own sounds with synthesis and trying to break this down super nice and simple so we can understand how powerful a tool it is as well to really getting your own sound. And instead of grabbing a preset and just hoping it's going to sound good, we kind of make sure it sounds good by ourselves. So coming back to what we just learned, that means that you're kind of looking for harmonics or waveforms that can give you something that we can subtract from. So if we change shape to the sawtooth, we already know from our meters that directly we've got lots of harmonics that our filter can be digging into and creating lots and lots of sounds as I bring that filter around. There's all sorts of different tones. But I've kind of jumped ahead a little bit because I think, like, for me personally, when I'm kind of learning subtractive synthesis and looking at something like this, I kind of think that the sine wave thing is very important to understand, that it's a very clean wave, which is great. If we wanted to make a clean bell sound like we get there, it's almost like a tom or a very clean sound, great. As I said, maybe we just process it with a few effects, and that's what we want, that kind of very clean bell sound, right? Or maybe we're making a kick drum and we want that as the starting. So it's not like a building block we don't ever use. We absolutely do use it, but we need to know that it isn't really full of harmonics, and we either need to create those through effects or layering with other waveforms. So if we turn on oscillator 2 and we have a sawtooth down here, okay. So now the two are contributing to a more powerful waveform of two a sawtooth combined with sine. So if I bring the volume down on my saw, I can decide how much of that is added to that sine wave. But I'm going to switch that off again. We're still sort of working our way along here to understand what we're doing. So waveforms, tone, generators, oscillators, the starting point of our building block. Building block number one, we want to sort of go to the oscillator and decide what are the waveform or waveforms that we're using. What else do we have in this section? We have octave, semi, and detune. These are a little bit about tuning that waveform if we wish, like we could be playing a C3, but we could actually tune it up an octave or down an octave or add some semitones to that. But we don't need to concern ourselves with that too much at the moment. The most important thing is to understand the harmonics of these different waveforms and how they're the building block number one of the basics of synthesis. Personally, for me, we already know about the filter section a little bit, and it's currently a high-pass filter. It's a nice filter. It's built into analog. I tend to start next after the oscillator section with the amp section. And that's the first place where we're going to come across. And what is the amplifier or the amp? Well, amplitude, it's another way to talk about volume, right? It's just essentially the volume knob. It's essentially the one big volume knob that decides the output of this synth. Pretty much that's the main thing that the amp section is doing. But what it also has is our very first kind of look and introduction to an envelope here. And I think the amp envelope after the oscillator is the next place I like to visit when I'm building a synth sound. So I'm sort of going, okay, waveform or waveforms, and then I'm working my way along. And then I'm going to the amp envelope and I'm sort of thinking about what is going to happen when I play a note. Okay, so that's kind of where we're heading next. Let me just check my notes here as we're going along. So let's talk for a second as we've moved to the amp. So as I said, put simply, the amp is just a big volume knob. Sometimes it's called a VCA. That again ties back to the hardware original days of synthesis, voltage controlled amplifier. So if you see a VCA, that's your amp. It's the part of the synthesizer which allows you to control the loudness of your sound. Okay, envelopes. This is where today we need to kind of get our maximum concentration, I think, a little bit, because I think a lot of people struggle with envelopes. The envelope doesn't make a sound itself, right? It's a control which causes changes in the setting of the synth over time. So it doesn't have anything to do with making a sound itself, but it causes changing in the settings of synthesis over time. And that time generally is us playing notes, really playing a note and letting go of a note, playing a key, letting go of a key, right? So if the envelope is directed to the amp, which is what we're looking at down there in the amp section, you're defining how loud and soft the sound gets over the course of the sound. So let's kind of start with that. So we're going to come back here and we're going to look at the amp envelope, and we're going to see down the bottom here that we've got these important parameter parts of it. The main ones we're focusing on is attack, decay, sustain, and release, right? ADSR as it's known. And again, if you're not familiar with that, you need to sort of get your head around it, as you're going to come across it in music all the time. Every sound, essentially, dog barking, has an envelope. It has ADSR, it has some form of sound of how quickly it rises to the loudest point it's going to get before decaying to complete silence, right? Every sound has some form of an envelope, and some sounds have very complicated envelopes and some have simple ones, right? So if we're looking at what analog gives us by default, we've not touched anything. The attack section of the ADSR here is instantly loud. Then we've got a bit of a decay, sort of in the middle there. It's not super fast and it's not super slow. And then we've got what we call the sustain, which is, if we're holding the key down, that's how long it will hold that level that you see there for. And when we let go of the key, so the sustain is very much tied to time, like holding the note down and keeping it held. The rest of them are happening like instantly. We touch the key, we go to the attack, then we go down to the decay portion, then we're still holding the note, we've got our sustain, and then we have the release section down to silence, right? So if we put the sustain instantly like down to 0 here, then now we actually are just going to go straight to the attack, straight down to the decay and 0 sustain. So we straight to the release and decaying. Now that sort of envelope there would represent many, many drum sounds. Like when you have a kick drum or a snare or a hi-hat, they're very fast to hit the loudest point and then decay and release pretty much straight away, right? So if you can wrap your head around this envelope section, you start to understand that there are many, many ways to shape your sounds in this area here. So envelopes are really important, and it's one of the reasons I did put pigments here, right? So let's say we close up our monitoring tools for a second over here on the analog track, and let's put pigments on for a moment. And we don't really need to worry too much about the monitoring because I've kind of shown you the waveforms and how they all work in the analog. But what we want to look at in pigments, which is the reason I have it here, is that we just have the default patch here, nothing fancy. And what we might do up here is let's make it the same as analog. Let's choose in engine 1 an analog engine, and let's just have oscillator 1, and let's have a sine wave, right? So same concept, right? And we're playing the same notes. What we have here though is really interesting, is we have in our envelope section in pigment this lovely representation of the travel of the note that I play through those different sections of the attack phase, the decay, the sustain, and the release. So if we watch here, we can kind of see a little bit. It's too fast what happens when I'm playing a note on my MIDI keyboard here. It's too fast. We don't really see the attack much. We're up here and we see the decay or the sustained area, and then we see the release, right? So let's slow down the attack a bit. We're going to make a slower attack. Let's make the release longer. Let's make the sustain down a bit. There we go. So it's really quite beautiful because it really helps us understand that. So what we're getting here is note depressed and then note released. And that's all those different stages unfolding over time. And I think it's a good idea sometimes to connect the envelope and the volume envelope to a keyboard and a key being depressed, because when you paint notes in the MIDI clip with your pencil, perhaps you're not really understanding the envelope is affected by when that note starts and when that note ends, right? So here we get the visual of that. So I'm just depressing my key and letting it go instantly, and because I've laid the envelope out a bit like I have, it's now going nice and gently through there, right? So if I'm playing a fast note, you can see I'm not even really getting to the release until I let it go. Okay, and if we put the sustain up, so one thing to learn about the ADSR envelope is that the decay parameter will be absolutely doing nothing if sustain is at its maximum, right? There is no decay phase when sustain is at the maximum. We just go to the attack, then we're sustained, and then we release. So decay and sustain, they are kind of tied together. They're in a marriage. So any point we could move our decay around if we like, but we're not really changing all that much at all, as we don't really have a decay section. We kind of, until we start to bring down our sustain, and then we are affecting now what happens between the attack and the sustain with the decay as soon as the sustain is down from its maximum. And if we jump from pigments for a second over to analog, it's exactly the same. So in analog, if we put the sustain all the way to the top and we are playing a note here and we try moving the decay around, we're not changing the sound at all in any way, shape or form, right? So decay and sustain are tied together. As soon as we bring the decay down, the sustain down a little bit, now we can introduce a decay. So sound rises to the attack instantly. Now decay is down to the sustain, and then gradually down to the release. So those two are important. I mean, they're all important, but it's really important to understand that. And it's why, as I said, I don't want you to rush out and buy Pigments if you don't have it. But as I said, it is often on sale and it's an amazing synth. But I do like the visual representation because, as I said, I think when it comes to understanding envelopes, we get the travel from the note being depressed to it being released, right? And if we adjust some of those things, so again, if we have, you know, a really plucky envelope here, straight up to the attack, and then straight down to the decay, and then straight out to silence, right? So if we want to change that, and then why am I sort of banging on about this? Well, perhaps some of you already know, but what I'm hearing by adjusting this is many, many different sort of sounds that are, again, in our locker. Maybe we want to make drum sounds with the synthesizer, then this kind of shape that I've got going on here would be a good starting point, right? For some kind of plucky type of drum sound using a synth. Maybe I want to make a nice pad that sort of slowly evolves. So I might have quite a lot of sustain, a long release, and a really slow attack, almost 100 milliseconds down here. So let's slow it right down the attack. So now you can see all that travel till it goes to silence, right? Because we've got a long release here. The release is what, 4 seconds, 5 seconds long. So we're deciding that once the sound's gone to the attack and then decayed to a bit of sustain and then down to the release, it's got 5 seconds before it's silent, right? So I think it's a good idea to kind of connect it, note on, note off. That's what envelopes are connected to in our world, right? When we're playing keys, notes are being triggered in a MIDI clip. They're triggering that envelope to start that sequence of however it is, you know, set up in terms of its attack, decay, sustain, release. And as I said, learning that envelope and how to shape it is going to unlock plucky sounds, sustained sounds, pad sounds, organ sounds, drum sounds, all of that, which is why synthesis is really powerful. So envelopes, very, very important to understand, and the amp envelope. That's what we've just looked at here. So in Pigments, VCA as it's called, that goes back, as I said, to the days of hardware, voltage controlled amplifier. So the amp envelope, that's to do with the volume, that big knob that controls the volume of the synth. And in this case, we're shaping that volume of the overall synth in Pigments, or if we're in analog. Everyone good with that? Thumbs up, I hope. So let's move on to back to the analog for a second. And this is the reason we're sort of using Pigments. In analog, we don't really have that visual representation of that time of travel from the note being depressed. Okay, but if we let the note go, let's actually just give ourselves a little bit more juice on the master, because we're playing with a very quiet sort of instrument, only one oscillator, so we'll just, okay, so you can kind of hear. So again, I'm just going to press a key and let it go. There it is, fading away to silence. That's the envelope shape we've got here, controlling that volume. Let's put the sustain right up, the release right in. So we're going to go straight to the attack. Instantly, we're not using any decay. The sustain's all the way to the max and the release is all the way to its minimum. So that's a instantly kind of, and that shape there, so this is the thing you kind of learn when you start doing this over a period of time and spending some time to learn this and understand it. That's the shape of an organ. So pretty much we can pretty quickly make like a church organ-y sound with it, that envelope. So I'm just playing some just basic chords with that one oscillator, right? We put our other oscillator on, so we've got a little bit more complex kind of waveform happening. So that's a very basic envelope that you can learn very quickly that will give you pretty much instantly sort of organ type tones. And if you get any pops and clicks, another thing you're going to understand with an envelope, also this ties into sampling, is if for any reason we have a little pop or a click, well, you can always add just a little bit of release, or in the other case, maybe just a little bit of attack, and that will really help to just kind of make them not quite so boxy, and the little boxy re-triggering of those envelopes, start and stopping of the notes, can make a little pop or a click. So in a sampler, you might want to do the same. You go straight to the ADSR, and you can bring the attack in a little slower and the release a little longer, and you can kind of trim those either ends just to get rid of a pop or a click, so you can play the instrument without any of those issues. So typically for me, I start with my oscillator and choose my waveform off the bat. That's going to be my tone generator. It's going to give me some harmonics if it's a sawtooth like we've got here. I'm going to jump to the amp and I'm going to say, okay, you know, what kind of sound am I making here? What are my thoughts? What's the shape of the envelope? And if I don't do anything, well, of course I have the default sort of shape, you know, which is something like more or less this if we don't do anything in Ableton, and it gives us fairly basic envelope. But if I sort of decided today I might want to make a pad sound, well, perhaps I'm going to start with a really, you know, a much slower attack. So it's a softer to get to the attacky point, or maybe I'm making a really plucky synth, so I'm going to have the attack really short, the sustain right down. Then I've got this really, you know, percussive sound. So maybe I'm making a plucky bass. Right? So that's the thinking that I want you to kind of understand in terms of the amp envelope. Really important player in the scheme of things. So let's kind of say we put it back to more or less Ableton's default. Just reset my synth there. We've got a sawtooth here. So now let's look at the filter section. So we know that we've kind of talked about that we wanted to, if we're doing subtractive synthesis, which is the building blocks of synth, we've got our oscillator section, we've got our amp section, we've got our envelope of the amp, which gives us kind of like, as I said, what's going to happen when we depress the note and release the note, maybe what style of sound we're aiming for. But in terms of subtractive synthesis, the filter is going to be a key player, right? So if we bring up, again, our Vox and Go span and our little combination of visual tools here, and we play our note with the sawtooth, we've now got something we can filter. And that's what subtractive synthesis is, right? And so we've got that character that we can put it right down to a very muted sound, or it could be a bit more open. Right, and if we look at what else we've got with the filter, well, we've got some resonance, which is going to, just like a normal filter, boost the area where we're cutting off, where we're, you know, applying the filter. So if you're looking at a filter as an audio effect, we should know by now that resonance is kind of either reducing a little bit the point where our filter frequency is cutting off, where it's doing the filtering, and it's sort of amplifying that, or kind of keeping it fairly neutral. So resonance can give us a bit of character in there, right? If we're looking for that. So we sweep our filter down and we can add a bit more character. Let's turn that off. And for example, a resonance filter, in the case of Ableton's analog, is really a powerful way to get those TB303 acid sounds, because it's all about more resonance. Along with a few other tricks. Also, if you're looking for a Daft Punk sort of sound, there's a really resonance filter. So analog's a great tool for messing around with that. But I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole there. So we've got our filter, we've got something to subtract. So again, want to point that out with the sine wave. As I said, sine wave, very neutral territory, no harmonics, so to speak of, waste of time kind of filtering, just a pure clean sine wave. So if you're making sub basses, a really great tip for that, due to that fact. Let's just do another MIDI track. Let's bring Ableton's wavetable in the mix. So we'll just drop that in, mainly because we are missing one waveform that is a little more common after these four. It's often found in other synths sort of after those four, and it's a triangle wave, which is kind of halfway between those two, right? So we can kind of make it in the analog, but you will find in other synths, such as the wavetable, also operator, you can actually get a triangle directly, right? Out of, for example, the basic shapes here in the wavetable in oscillator A, we can go and between a sine and a saw directly and have ourselves a triangle, right? In analog, you can make it out of two, but there's not a direct choice of choosing it. So wavetable, yes. Operator, yes. There are triangle waves. What does that mean? Well, triangle as a sub bass means that, just make sure we don't have any of these tools behind the wavetable. So let's fix that. Let's copy this guy over. Okay. So what you can see already with the triangle is, again, we've got harmonics. So that's going to mean that if you're making a sub bass, so you go super low, we've got a little more character to it than if it's a sine wave sub bass. Sounds like a click. Now, sine wave sub bass could get very easily lost in your mix and just be almost mud if you're putting a sub bass in there. But if you've got a triangle, well, you can hear it a bit better yourself. And again, you've got something that it makes sense to filter it and develop the sound of it, right? So there's another tip. So a triangle wave can be another great waveform to sort of have in your locker. And as I said, in Ableton, we can access it nice and directly from wavetable. And if we put an operator here, we can also go to oscillator A into the waveforms here, and there's a triangle down here. Nice, sounds good. So yeah, that's a good tip for working. Again, next step from a sine wave, I want something like a sine wave, but I want a little bit of harmonics that I could use in a subtractive sense, right? So that's the idea behind that. Okay, so last but not least, our subtractive synth. We've got our different sections: waveform, tone generator, the oscillator. Then we've got our amp envelope. Our amp section and our amp envelope. And then we've got our filter. And guess what? The filter has an envelope as well. Once again, we're introduced to ADSR. And in the case of the analog, the filter envelope is attached directly. It's mapped there, right? It's already on the filter, whereas there are a lot of synths you'll generally find. Some synths don't even have the amp envelope connected. You might have to pick an envelope and connect it to the amp section, but often you'll find an amplitude section of a synth will have already its dedicated own envelope, or sometimes they're shared, actually, the filter and amp envelope. So I have a synth sitting in front of me that I'm using as my MIDI controller by Yamaha, and that shares its amp envelope and filter envelope, so you can switch between the two. So there's a few different combinations. In analog, it's already there. It's got its own dedicated envelope attached to it. Let's say with wavetable, for example, if we put that back on this other track, that doesn't have that. But we do have two spare envelopes in wavetable, and generally for me, one of the first things I'm going to do is take one of those envelopes and dedicate that to potentially the filter, and it's going to drive that filter. So it is actually nice to have envelopes that are open and available to be applied to different things, but sometimes you'll get variations of these. If we go to pigments and we open that up, so pigments is much like the wavetable. It has an envelope section, VCA, so that's already dedicated to the amplitude and the amp, but we have two spare envelopes. So again, what you could do is go here to envelope 2. There's our envelope there in the case of pigments. And what we could do is basically assign it like it says, and we could drag it over here and put it on the filter cutoff. So if you're using something like serum or pigments, now we have control over the filter here in pigments. Let's just make sure we're on the pigment synth. We need a better waveform again. So again, we get our visual representation. Now, probably we'll stay in pigments for a second because this is perhaps the last sort of complex piece. Maybe, as I said, we do a little bit of modulation as well. But one of the last complex pieces is if we have a filter envelope, it is also then affecting the overall sounds, right? So we've got the amp envelope doing the amplitude change and how I sort of set it up already here in pigments previously with this attack, decay, sustain, release settings. But the filter envelope is then also reacting to the same note being pressed and released, right? So the amp envelope is still doing its cycle as it always was. We've now also got this kind of secondary envelope adjusting then the filter at the same time as the notes coming on and off, and so it's actually opening and closing this filter over here. So again, you can kind of see how it's traveling. So let's kind of make it something similar so you can kind of get your vision around it a little bit more. And you can see the synth itself, or the filter, sorry, is reacting to me depressing my key and letting it go now. But think of that like as a secondary stage. So we've got kind of, that's why I go to the amp envelope first, right? That's deciding whether I'm kind of making a pad or a pluck or a drum sound. And the filter envelope is kind of deciding how the filter's behaving when I open and close, when I play a key and release the key, right? So it's kind of another building block on top. It's not what I would go to first. It's kind of what I would be using to decide what my filter might be doing post my amplitudes, right? So it's already a little bit more technical because we don't have to have a filter envelope at all, right? We can sweep the filter around without an envelope. We can do it in automation. We can do it manually. But if we add an envelope to it, you can see that not only are we triggering our note, but we're triggering a filter, and it kind of sounds pretty cool. And generally what we can do as well is we can have positive values of that modulation and negative. And so currently this filter envelope, the envelope 2 that I assigned to the filter frequency in pigments, its positive value. That means it's going to open the filter from the frequency cutoff value. So it's opening up from there. And if you look carefully, you can kind of see that the way it's reacting is opening. So if we were to change the value over here to a negative, well, then it's going to be closing the filter down from there. Let's make our envelope a bit faster. Okay, so good thing to get your head around. Again, pigments helps us quite a bit with the visual representation of note on off, triggering the envelopes, what's happening over those different stages of ADSR. So if we come back to our good friend analog, and we're remembering that we're doing subtractive synthesis as our starting points, we have a filter envelope here built in, and it's already there. Now it's not doing a huge amount, but visually we don't sort of see it, right? That's the thing with the analog, is that in the filter section there is an envelope, an ADSR envelope, but we don't see how it reacts to the note triggering on and off. You kind of have to tune your ears into that one to listen to what's going on. But a key thing as well that you often find is, so let's tie this in because this is important, in the pigments, what I was doing here. So if we kind of like, let's start this again from scratch. So let's say we unassign it and we put this envelope back to its sort of default. So there it is there, envelope 2. It's not doing anything, it's just floating around, it's available to us. So we're going to assign it. So again, we can come up here and assign it. And we're going to assign it to the filter cutoff. So that's kind of tied that step in there. And I just kind of lost my place slightly about what I was going to say. It might come back to me in a moment. But yes, that's what I wanted to say. Sorry, I just lost my place for a second. What I wanted to talk about is this here is important because it's the amount of that envelope being applied. So if it's 0, as you can see, no change, right? So even though it's assigned to the filter cutoff, there's no envelope amount. So there's no modulation of the filter cutoff with the filter envelope. It's just there, but it's not doing anything. As soon as we give it a envelope amount, positive or negative, then it's going to be triggering that cutoff in this case. I don't know if I still have it mapped properly. I think I don't, as I'd need to remap it. But essentially, because I zeroed out the amount, so let's maybe do it a second time again. Let's just reassign it here. And as you can see, there's already an amount applied. I think actually I realized the reason why I'm not here, it's because I'm not on pigments. That might help. There we go. So it wasn't what I just said a moment ago, but now we're correct, right? So essentially, let's do it if we now just zero this out, right? So again, no movement, no modulation of this, but if we apply some cutoff amount, so you must have a certain, you're saying to the filter how much envelope's being applied to it. And a little tip for that, bit of an advanced one, it can be very, very nice to modulate, automate the filter cutoff amount as opposed to automating the frequency cutoff itself. Be really nice because what you're actually doing instead of this action, let's just put our synth back up a bit. So you're actually automating that amount up and down instead of actually what most people might do, which is the cutoff. So it could be an interesting thing to try where you actually modulate, or sorry, automate the filter cutoff amount. How much filter envelope is being applied, negative values or positive. Again, positive opening the filter up from the frequency cutoff, negative closing it down. Really interesting stuff. Bit advanced, but very cool stuff. Maybe for those of you that understand that, it could be really a good little tip for you. By the way, if you are here in the live stream today, do say hello. We heard from Gerosphere before, Chavi Diaz. Hopefully everything's running good and you're enjoying the stream and you're learning lots. That would be a good thing. If you've got any questions, hit me up, let me know, and I'll do my best to answer them. So let's come back to our friend analog, and let's now tie that in because we were just on pigments. Now we're going back to analog. So analog, key thing is down here, envelope 4.00. Well, that's actually that amount of envelope that's being applied to this filter. So right out of the gate, without me doing anything today, it was already set at a little bit of filter envelope being applied here. Jesus Moreno, pardon, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes. How are you doing? So if I open up that envelope amount, we're probably not going to hear any change, and I'll explain why. So let's open that up. Sounds the same, right? Let me put it back to 4. So let's type in there 4. Okay, here we go. All right, so if I raise that up and down, so listen to the tone, there's nothing. So it's because it won't do anything until we move that cutoff, right? So remembering the amount is how much envelope's being applied, but something that's important to note is it's only being applied if we're actually doing any filtering, right? So if we now bring the cutoff, let's say we bring it to the middle here, now there's a bit of a difference. And if we put more envelope or negative, it's a different behavior, right? So we do need to have some cutoff. So let's bring the cutoff around there and let's have positive envelope. Let's maybe change our envelope a little bit of a longer release, more sustain, more attack, slower attack. So we can get this wah-wah kind of sound if we bring the attack around a bit on the filter envelope. So important to note, the envelope amount has a key role to play. Again, it's saying how much of this ADSR envelope is going to be working on the filter, right? And as I said, if the filter cutoff doesn't move around, if you leave it straight out the box, like I said, I'm sure many people have been using this for a very long time. That is the analog, and they've never changed this value here. So they're having a little bit of filter envelope on the frequency cutoff, but it's not a huge amount. And it's positive, right? So what it would be doing visually, if we were looking at it in pigments, it would be opening that filter up ever so slightly from this cutoff point. So wavetable in Ableton's world is a good one. We'll jump over to there. For visually inside of Ableton, if you don't have pigments, you can visualize what is going on with the filter and what we're talking about here inside of Ableton. How do we do that? Well, the same as pigments, in wavetable, we don't have it automatically connected. There isn't an envelope connected to our filter here. So what we need to do, let's give ourselves a sawtooth in wavetable. So we've got lots of harmonics. Nice. And then what we're going to do is we want this filter frequency cutoff here of our filter number 1. We want that to be attached to an envelope. So if we just click the frequency and then jump to the matrix, and then here we now see, so whatever we're clicking, right, will show up down the bottom here. So if we see filter 1 frequency, great. And then what we can do is play like battleships. We can line up the 2 points together there and say, okay, let's give envelope 2 to the filter frequency. So let's do that. Let's say 100% of that envelope 2 is being applied to frequency 1. I don't think we're going to hear a change again. Why? Because same as the analog, there is no frequency cutoff, but as soon as we bring it down, okay. So in wavetable, let's put the filter cutoff in the middle here. In wavetable, we can see the modulation of the envelope on the filter. So we've put envelope 2 on the filter frequency, and there you go. You can see it's opening that up. When I press the key and let it go, it's triggering that filter to open and close. So if we bring this down a bit, just a little bit of modulate, a little bit of envelope. If we go negative again, now you'll be able to see it closing down from there. So you can see that triggering of the envelope, right? Opening and closing our filter. Very nice. And if we change our envelope 2's ADSR, that's going to change the behavior of that opening and closing of the filter. So let's say we go again for a bit of that slower attack feel. You get this wah-wah. This is a very plucky, fast re-triggering of the envelope. making the filter very percussive, very plucky, that it opens and closes super fast. So I think we've kind of dug into envelopes a fair bit. I hope you feel a little bit more comfortable with them. It's really important to connect them to the triggering of a note on off event, which, as I said, I think it does help to learn that with a MIDI keyboard, so you kind of get the feel for what's going on when you play the note and release it. If you're painting the notes in the MIDI clip, be careful and make sure you understand, like, so let's do that. Let's say if we've got a very short note like this, let's say we take away the filter envelope for a moment and put all the filter back. And let's just concentrate on the amp envelope, right? We can see the stage of that note starting in this phrase here. It's just one bar, so let's close these down for a moment. We don't need those for a second. So almost at the end of the bar here, we're almost at silence, but not quite. So if we bring the release further in, it'll stop before the end of the bar. And if we bring the sustain down, absolutely, it's going to happen a lot quicker. So slowly rising up to the attack here now instead. Let's put a second note in here. So you can hear the start of each of those notes. It's starting this sequence of the envelope again. If I put a longer release here, the release is really short, but now the end of the first note is still going when the second note starts, so they start to blur together. If I make the release longer, they're going to turn into not mud, but they're a lot harder to hear. There's two notes there, right? Because the first note's release is extending right into the start of this note. But if I bring that release back, you can kind of hear it finishes here somewhere. So we clearly hear the phase of each envelope properly, right? So that's what we're talking about here when it comes to particularly our volume envelope, right? So again, if we wanted to make sort of, let's say we turn this into a different kind of sound, let's say, and let's make our one bar longer. So we can kind of hear where the release is quite short at the moment. So let's make a longer release. So we've got this lovely sort of rounded kind of smooth sound that's like perfect for sort of something like a pad. If we want it a little bit pluckier, we can bring the attack a little bit closer, a little bit shorter. So it gets quicker to that attack. If we bring the sustain down, we then have a decay phase. So up to the attack, down to the decay, sustained, and then fading away. So we can hear. So I think it's really fascinating, and if you kind of spend a bit of time listening to music, you can start to hear different envelopes, and that's kind of, let's talk about that for a little second here. I've got some examples over here of some different instruments, right? Some real world instruments, and all of those instruments, they are coming back to our synthesis lesson today. Well, what makes all of those instruments different? So we've got here a clarinet, a flute, an oboe, a saxophone, and a trumpet. what makes them all different is the timbre, the tone, the color, the timbre side of it, all the little harmonics that the instrument creates, all the vibrations, all the different little harmonics, and the envelope, right? So if you kind of look at these visually, I can tell straight away. So this particular one is the, what have we got at the top here? A violin. Okay, so the violin's got a really slow attack, lots of sustain, and then a very fast decay and release to silence. Okay, and then if we go to the clarinet, something similar. Let's turn up the volume a bit here. So again, a bit like a sausage. So very fast, long, sustained note, and then decaying away to very similar looking to the violin. The flute, we'll have a listen in a moment. That goes very quickly to the attack, and then again, very full sustains astounding, then tailing away very fast as well. The oboe, something similar. Well, that has a longer, slower tailing off, and then the saxophone here. So if we listen to a few of these. And what we can do as well is if we kind of bring up our little tools, and that's the reason these guys are here as well, just to show us a little bit about what I'm sort of now explaining. So if we put this up here, we put our Vox and Go as well in the mix. Let's bring that down. Okay, let's play the violin. So we can see all of its harmonics. It's waveform. It's got plenty of harmonics. And that's what makes that violin a unique instrument, this series of harmonics and vibrations that it's making. You can kind of feel it sort of quite gradually comes in, reaches its peak, sustains, and then sort of fades away. Let's have a look at the clarinet. Quite different. It's waveform, right? That's what makes that unique. And again, a little bit how that envelope is shaped. So if you were trying to recreate all of these sounds of the synth, you'd need to understand how to build those harmonics, right, of all those unique instruments, and the envelope that sort of how they shape the volume of that particular instrument. So have a look at the flute. Flute's an interesting one, because with the flute, it kind of has lots of little stages of envelopes. If you listen carefully, it kind of like would need multiple envelopes, is because it kind of sort of like continues to sort of re-trigger almost within the one sound here. Super interesting. Oboe. And what I've done here as well is all of these instruments, by the way, they're all playing the same note. They're all playing the C5, so that makes it nice and easy as well. We're not playing different pitches, just so that you understand there's a bit of a test here that's kind of more concrete, because they're all playing the same note and same pitch. We're not kind of moving up and down in frequency or pitch, which would change the speed of the oscillations and all that kind of technical stuff. So we're kind of looking at like for like, note-wise, but we're seeing lots of differences in harmonics, and we can kind of hear quite a difference across the board as well about how we might, if we were trying to synthesize those sounds, go about creating the envelope. So I think that's kind of interesting to take a look at. I know I had a few other sounds over here as well, but I think they're not going to tell us too much more than what we just kind of looked at. So where are we at? Subtractive synthesis, the building blocks of synthesis are oscillators, amps, and filters. Harmonics are important to us, oscillators are important to us. Just going to check my notes, make sure we're traveling through, and we've kind of broken down most of the sections that I want to help you guys and girls with. Let's just check here. So I did actually write down, by the way, I've sort of gone into the filter envelope, but if the envelope is applied to the filter, it controls how open or how closed the filter is over the course of the sound. So that's kind of what I wrote in my own notes. Also, when it comes to the attack, decay, sustain, release, our friend ADSR, here's my notes, or what I wrote. The attack knob controls how long it takes for the sound to reach its max volume, so how fast it does that. The decay knob sets what happens to the sound after the sound has reached its maximum volume in the attack. It defines how quickly or slowly then the volume will decrease from the max to 0 unless the sustain knob is used. Remember, those two are married, they're linked together, in which case if it is used, it will decrease to the volume level set with the sustain, so it comes down, decays down to that sustained, holds there as long as you keep the note depressed, and then goes into the release phase. So the sustain knob sets the volume that the decay drops to, and that will be held as long as the key is depressed. Once the key is released, the release knob controls how long it takes the volume and the sound to drop from the level set by the decay or sustain to 0, right? So hopefully that's all good in the hood. And we kind of understand basically those kind of basic points of subtractive synthesis and the building blocks of synthesizers. And, you know, if we talk about things that we might know out there, some storytelling for a second, what about the 808, the famous Roland drum machine, the Roland TR-808? So if we're thinking about, what kind of sounds can we make with these beautiful synths and all these synths we have in Ableton? Well, we can make an awful lot of sounds, right? Drums, as I said, bass lines, pads, leads, FX. Synth can make fantastic FX. Vocals, maybe not really. Real instruments, maybe not really. Sometimes we can get close. They're playing great patches that sound brassy, right? Or sound like a piano, but then we start looking at samplers, which I probably should cover in another session, if you like, where we deep dive into those and look at how they're an instrument as well, where we put audio inside and then we play that as an instrument. Well, that opens up doors because we can put all those beautiful recordings we just had inside an instrument and then use that as the tone generator, the waveform, the oscillator, right? That's a sampler. Anyway, back to my friend, the TR-808. So it's often referred to more than a drum machine actually as a drum synthesizer. Why? Because every sound in that drum machine or synthesizer is all made with synthesis. There is no samples. There is no recording of someone playing a drum kit. It's all made with synth sounds. That's, I think, exciting because that means we can do that with the tools that we have, and we can make our own versions of it, right? We could try and make 808 kicks, 808 snares, 808 hi-hats, etc., but we can also modify them and turn them into our own sounds. What about the TR-909, the other Roland drum machine famous in house and techno? Well, that uses a combination of synthesis and some real samples. So if I remember correctly, the real samples in the 909 are the crash, the ride, and the hi-hats. They are sampled from actual drums. And the synthesized sounds then are the bass drum, the snare, and the tom. So again, pretty cool, I think. So, you know, we can use synths to create brand new sounds, and that's why they're kind of really interesting for us to learn all about them. And we can also use them sometimes to try and create another sound that we might be trying to emulate a little bit. But yeah, I think, as I said, if you learn this, get good at it, practice it, understand it, you can make lots and lots of sounds and develop your own unique sound and start making the music sound like the way you want it to, instead of, you know, trusting presets and searching your way around those to find what you're looking for. So let's now maybe have a little bit of a play around and let's set ourselves a bit of a challenge or two here to make some sounds with what we've got. And let's also, as I said, we might just jump back for a second to a little screen image I had before. So let's jump there. Let's just remember as well what we've got in our locker in Ableton Live, you know. So we've got covered you know, subtractive synthesis, FM synthesis, additive synthesis, wavetable synthesis, bitimbral synthesis, granular synthesis, and physical modeling. So there's no coming back to Heath saying, well, I don't have in my locker, you know, lots of different types of synth sounds. So think of it, like I said, a rack of guitars. You've got all these beautiful timbres and tones and different ways you can go about making sounds. All of those synths, including hardware synths, pretty much Maybe the physical modeling ones will be a bit foreign. We can kind of put them to one side and the granulator to one side, but most of the other synths, we can go directly to them and we can learn what we've been going through today and say, oscillator, amp, filter, let's get a sound cooking. And that's what I'm trying to teach you here today. If I go to a friend's studio and he's got some beautiful hardware synths in there, I can sort of sit in front of one of those and start building a sound from it, right? So let's say on this list here that the physical modeling ones, tension, electric, and collision, we kind of put them to one side of it because they're not, they're not built the same way as oscillator, filter, amp type concept. They have some of those elements within, but they're a bit different. And the granulator, again, has ADSR, has filters, but the waveform or the oscillator is going to come from samples that you put inside of it. And the collision, tension, and electric, they build us like really cool percussion sounds, cool string sounds, cool electric piano sounds, and they're meant to sound like real world instruments. That's what physical modeling synthesis is. So got pretty good range of stuff in our locker. So let's jump back to Ableton and let's just kind of prove this a little bit in the sense that let's do a bit of cleaning up here. We don't need these tracks anymore over here. Pigment's our friend here also. Well, it was, we might make something in there in a moment, but it's great to give us that visual representation of the envelopes, what I like about it. Also, these clips here are not really doing anything. So let's say, for example, that we start from 0 with a few of these instruments, right? And let's say we're in Ableton and we're going to have a wavetable on one track, and we're going to have let's say an operator in the mix as well, and we're going to have a meld, all of these lovely things that we have in our locker, and we're going to have our friend the analog, which is the one that I think doesn't give us a lot of visual clues, but it's a great one to learn on because it's all about subtractive synthesis, the good place to start. And as I said, if we wanted to look at something else, we could also have the drift, which is similar to the analog, perhaps just a little bit more modern, more updated, but also very much a sort of subtractive synth, pretty much, right? And literally just with this amount here, and also we could do the same with pigments. Let's get ourselves a brand new pigments as well, just so we don't have anything left behind from what we were doing before. Right, and we're just going to do a quick little experiment here. And by the way, I hope you're enjoying this stream. If you're with me today, I know it's a lot of speaking today. It's very much a teaching one. I'm sure I'll do one coming up soon where we'll just make some music and hang out and do that. But I really feel like, as I said, unpacking this, getting your head around it, is one of the top 3 things that will really help you, get on the pathway to making the music that you probably desire and wish to make, and make it sound the way you want it to. If you're a complete beginner, you certainly don't need to jump down all these pathways, but if you've been doing music for a while and you're always using presets, well, at the very minimum, you can perhaps adjust the presets a little bit, and then you could start kind of, going from there by making your sounds from scratch. So pigments, we're going to set to the default, so nothing going on inside of it, any preset of any sort. And let's start with pigments. So we're just looking at pigments and we're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do today? We're going to make a sound from 0. Well, first of all, we're going to head to the oscillators. Where are the oscillators here in pigments? They're called the engines here, and there's 2 of them up the top here, the basic starts. And we can see that if we click on engine 1, we've actually got some different types of synthesis within pigments. It's why I explained earlier, if you weren't with us, that it's a very powerful synth actually, because it can do like sort of few of the Ableton devices combined in one. It does sampling, it does wavetable, and it does like an analog synth. So let's say we choose analog, and we have oscillator 1, and we have a sawtooth there as the waveform, and let's say we arm pigments. So where are we here? So there we are with pigments as a default sawtooth wave. Let's say we want to have a nice plucky envelope. We're going to make a nice plucky sound, then we might go straight to the volume envelope, so we can find that down here, envelope VCA, and then we can start adjusting the ADSR. So this would be the pathway. I would be here, I would bring my sustain down, maybe my decay in a little bit. So that's a nice sort of short and sharp sound, maybe have a little bit of release. So when I play it, I'm kind of getting the feel of the envelope I'd like, or maybe, as I said, I've got this loaded up on another track and I want to make it into sort of something like a bit more of a pad, perhaps. Maybe I do some chord stabs. So maybe I'd like a little bit, again, a bit more release. Maybe a little bit of a slower attack, so it's not quite so sharp on the attack. You know, so stabby, plucky, sustain. Let's go really slow, like I'm going really slow, sort of sustain pads in the background sort of thing, perhaps. Bit more release. Nice, right? And all we're dealing with here is just the very basics. Then I might think to myself, okay, I'm happy with that volume envelope. I'm happy with the waveform for now. Or maybe I'd like a little bit more spice in the waveform. So if we were to sort of open up our visual tools a bit, I think I'm covering my face there with the webcam. So I'll probably just try and avoid that for a second. Although covering my face isn't a bad thing. So what was I thinking to show you here? That's right, back to the sort of waveform, right? And harmonics. So if we're kind of looking at our span for a second and an oscilloscope, we can have just the docked one down here. So we'll leave that one open down there. So we've got all those lovely harmonics. Let me just play a chord I can hold and then do something else. So maybe we just add oscillator 2 in here, and so we make a bit of a more complex waveform. So instead of just the saw, even though the saw's got lots of lovely goodies to it, let's bring up the volume on oscillator 2, and let's make that a square wave. Balance the volumes between them a bit. And what we could do also is, you know, potentially tune that a little bit different as well. And now we've got all this beautiful harmonics over here, right, that give us plenty to work with. So if, for example, we now take out one of these oscillators, still see we've got lots of harmonics, but if we add that in, we've got a more complex waveform. You can probably see it best down here in the display of the oscilloscope, right? So now we can filter that a little bit. Lovely. And sometimes just rolling that filter off, we've got literally probably, I would say, hundreds of different tones we could come up with there just with now applying the filter post what I've just kind of done so far, right? So if we just play this one chord, that's subtractive synthesis in a nutshell. But what we might do is let's spice it up a little bit. Let's go with our filter envelope, the concept that we looked at a little bit before. So we've got 2 spare envelopes here in Pigments. We've actually got lots of stuff under the hood here. But let's have envelope 2. And what I also love, by the way, with pigments, this is a pretty fun little thing that we have here with pigments, is that you can actually kind of click on something like this and you can hover over something with that clicked, and you can kind of hear what it would sound like if it's changing that. But we need to make it a little bit more extreme than it currently is, but you can kind of set it up to hear a little bit what it might do, but we need to find something a bit kind of, yeah, a little bit more. Let's open the filter back up and then we can try that a little bit. Nice. So you can kind of move it around and do like a preview essentially of what it's going to change. So I'm going to assign it to the cutoff like there. And now we're going to have our envelope 2 on the filter cutoff a little bit, acting as an envelope, so when we trigger our chords, we now get this nice reaction on the filter. So that's the first kind of thing that we've taken from the subtractive concept, which was the voltage controlled amplifier, the oscillators, tone generation, then shaping those harmonics with our volume envelope, then shaping them with the filter, and then putting an envelope on the filter in this case to give ourselves some modulation, a different instrument to play. And if we take that modulation away, it's quite a different instrument, right? Still nice sounding, but we need to reach over here and can move the cutoff ourselves, but it's much more expressive if we sort of go back around and actually assign that filter envelope to that. Lovely. So that's pigments, right? So that was a look at pigments. Now, if we go sort of somewhere else to a different synth, we're kind of just basically putting all these synths here to sort of say, well, how do we go about it, right? So analog, we already know. We can go straight here to the oscillators. We have 2 by default turned on. We can always turn one of them off and start with just 1 oscillator. If you want to start with 2, you can start with 2. Obviously, you've got a more complex waveform if you start with 2. If you start with 1, you can kind of like perhaps use that to begin with. Let's make an organy type sound. So envelope, full sustain, short release. And let's say a sine wave. Not much harmonics there, right? So let's say we have a little bit of play it up a little bit higher. So there's a fast sort of organy, electronic kind of organy sound with the analog. Oscillators gave you my tone. I've layered 2 of them. Again, if we turn on this rack, we'd see that we've increased our kind of, you know, harmonics, and also, so let's do that, we'll just put that there. So you can see, you know, the harmonics, but also the waveform again. So I'm constantly sort of doing this just so you can see again what the difference that's made, right? So if we take away oscillator 2, we're back to that, just that pure sine wave. But by having oscillator 2, a little bit of saw, we've got much more harmonics, and we can bring our filter into action. Right, so I think we've sort of gone through the basics there pretty much. All of these synths, again, drift, we can go straight here and we could see the oscillator 1, oscillator 2. We could see our tone generating sections. Again, we can see we've got an increased amount of waveforms here in the case of drift. So there's some interesting options as far as oscillator goes from analog. Remembering analog has just a very, very basic building blocks, whereas drift is offering us a bit more of a modern improvements to the analog. And again, there's our oscillator sections. We've got oscillator 1, 2. We've also got a noise oscillator down here that we can add into the mix. And actually, I must point out that analog is more powerful than it looks on the surface, as well as it has a noise oscillator also that can be switched on to add some noise. So we don't have to sacrifice one of our 1 or 2 oscillators as a noise waveform. We can actually add a noise waveform on top. And similarly, actually hidden in each oscillator section of analog, you actually have a sub oscillator here, which has a little, just a simple little level control to it, where you can actually add an octave below, also another oscillator giving you a bit more bass in, as I said, an octave below the frequency that you're playing. So analog's a little bit more powerful under the hood, so we can actually develop our, again, sound further than just the first 2 oscillators. We've got sub and noise, drift, similarly 1 and 2, and then a noise oscillator. Don't think that's a sub oscillator from memory, like the analog, but it has a noise oscillator. Similarly, if we were navigating our way around this, and this is the concept for today, we can find over here envelope 1, envelope 2, and what we can try and understand with that kind of thing is, like, you know, one of those is tied to the amp, which is envelope 1. So this is automatically tied to volume, right? And you can see here, you can switch between the 2 envelopes in the middle here. And 2, again, could be used, or 1, to do various assignments. So maybe you say 2 in this case is attached to the filter. That's how it's currently set up by default. And so your envelope 2 would be adjusting the filter, and envelope 1 would be adjusting the amp. But there's some interesting possibilities here to, again, change that around a bit, but we're starting to find familiar targets that are going to help us get the sound we're looking for, right? So drift, we can go in here, follow the same path, oscillator, tone, harmonics, subtractive synthesis, envelope, filter, bang, we've got a bit of a sound happening, right? So maybe the next step is to look at another type of that synthesis that's in the locker, right? Because so far we're working our way around these synths, but we're talking about subtractive synthesis, the building blocks of synthesis. Wavetable, if we go to the wavetable, the very default setup of it, again, this very first oscillator, it's set up to do kind of subtractive synth. It basically has a wavetable that you can scroll between a sawtooth, a square, saw, triangle, and sine, and of course anywhere in between is kind of quite interesting. So you do have a little bit of difference to subtractive synth. You can have little waveforms that are kind of a small blend between some of them. And a triangle, like I said, is quite nice because we don't have that in analog by default. So yeah, right now we could use the wavetable as a subtractive synth. And again, if we're over on wavetable and we're here, and we've got our oscillator, we've got our amp envelope here, so we can straight away get stuck into that to make the sort of sound we're aiming for. Okay, and we can we're dealing with familiar characters, like I said, and we're finding them in familiar sections. Similarly to the pigments a little bit, well, wavetable's interesting. The filter side of it doesn't automatically have an envelope assigned. It's the same as pigments. It has 2 free envelopes and we can use them how we want. So it's a pretty fast move. If you have been with me already in the stream for a while, you'll see that I showed you how to use that a moment ago in wavetable. So hopefully you can kind of see what I'm talking about. When I have a synth sitting in front of me, I'm going to identify those sections of the synth, and just with those sections I can get the subtractive synthesis happening, right? Operator, if we jump over to that, that also has you know, the oscillators on the left now. Now, operator's already a little bit different because it has 4 oscillators stacked from A, B, C, and D here on the left-hand side. If we want to use it as a subtractive synth, because actually in its default configuration, it's an FM synthesis. That's how it's kind of set up right now to work. If we wanted to treat it as a subtractive synth, we would need to go to this little traffic light system down here on the global shell, this little shell here that I've clicked in now. And this traffic light here is telling us how the oscillators interact with each other, right? And the traffic light being straight up and down like that means that the different oscillators are actually modulating each other, and that is what creates FM synthesis. But we can very easily come to this and flip the traffic light to this version here. And now each of the oscillators are essentially just adding to a bigger waveform. So similarly to what we're looking at in analog or drift or wavetable, we can start adding, we can switch off B, C, and D, but we could add oscillator B to A and have a different waveform in there and start making a more complex, harmonic, rich tone and waveform, right? So that's how you would turn operator into a subtractive synth. But operator is the sleeper of Ableton's Locker, alongside, I think, Meld is an absolute stunning synth, the newest one in 12 for its capabilities, and it gives a whole new, again, brings a whole new sound to Ableton. Operator can do subtractive, as we just saw. It can do FM synthesis, as it is by default, and it can also do something called additive synthesis, which is really interesting, where we can dig into the oscillator in here and we can actually draw in our own oscillators, right? So we might explore that in the future, but operator, if you come back to my little chart, which I'm going to put for free as a little PDF, my little chart that I put together today explaining what the different synths in Ableton's Locker can do, then additive is one of the things that operator can do that the others can't, right? So let's maybe then finally touch on Meld. Meld, again, if we were looking at it out of the gate, no changes made just yet from the default. We've got 2 oscillators, A and B, and we start very similar to the wavetable, actually, with a wavetable. So if we turn off B and just look at A, we've got simply, a basic wavetable of the basic wave shapes, exactly like wavetable. And if we use this shape knob right next to the oscillator, we can go all the way from sine down here up to square there, sword in there, triangle kind of in here, right? And again, if you were to put my little oscilloscope there, I don't know where I've moved it to now, there it is there, right? So it's the advantage of having an oscilloscope. You know, you can, I'll drop a link also to this one. As I said, it's a Max for Live free one. You can now kind of see what kind of waveform you're making here, right? So if we move the shape, there's our sine, there's our triangle pretty much, there's our saw, and now saw morphing into square. So that's pretty cool. And then you can further shape that with the tone, and you can see what that's doing, right? It's actually shaping the square wave in this case to being wide or more narrow. So again, we've got a familiar character here. We've got our oscillator, tone generator. We've got 2 of them that we could stack on top of each other, but we just follow oscillator A across. Straight away we arrive, oh great, there's our amp envelope. Oh great, what have we got next to that? We've got sort of an open envelope potentially. Is it assigned to the filter by nature? No, it isn't. So again, you know, once you get into this, and you've been doing this for a while, the more modulation sources, the more open envelopes that your synth has, or VST or hardware, the more envelopes that aren't tied to anything, but you can use them how you want, the more LFOs, which we can look at in the future, that aren't tied to anything, you can use them to do whatever you want. And that's really powerful. So if I'm buying a synth, that's something I'm really considering, is what are those options. So this is great. If we look here, we've got an envelope that we could assign to different things. If we actually open up the matrix of meld and you sort of dig into here, well, when it comes to, you know, modulation and looking here, we've got envelopes, amp and modulation on the left here, and then we've got 3 different types of LFOs and all sorts of cross modulation possibilities. It's a very, very powerful synth for, you know, developing into in the future, but we can use it just very basically like we've seen with what we've been learning today. We can approach it the same way. Super long release, 9 seconds long. It's going to take a long time to get to silence. There we go. So what are the difference with all of these? Well, in this case, the way I'm sort of showing it to you, they can all be used as subtractive synths. If we use them all as subtractive synths, the differences would be more or less the envelopes and the LFOs and the filters that are available to us and things like that. It's when we, you know, what other differences they're going to give us is like in the meld, we have all these different, if I start going through oscillator A, we get all these different oscillators, right, that we don't have in analog. So we get lots and lots of different waveforms here to play around with, all sorts of really interesting ones. I love this sub one. So that's what's going to separate it. So we're still using meld like a subtractive synth, oscillator, envelope, filter, but we've got different tone generating oscillators. We've got different filters here. We've got all these beautiful filters listed down here. Whereas if we go all the way back to analog, well, it's much more simple. We've got just the very basic wave shapes. Yes, we can blend them with another wave shape and make a more complex waveform. We can add noise, we can add sub. It's still pretty cool, but meld is taking that, you know, to a different direction. So this is, so we can use all of these subtractively, but we can use them, you know, they bring different things to the table, even as a subtractive synth. So, you know, operator, again, if we look at an oscillator in operator and we click in here, we've got more saws, more sines, more square waves, so more possibilities, but it still can be used subtractively. And I think start subtractive and then we add onto that subtractive synthesis concept of oscillator, amp, filter. We then start adding modulation. Today we've looked at the filter envelope because I think it's an important one to look at because it's right there. And in the case of analog, it's already applied to the filter. It's already attached and connected. The others we've had to connect sometimes ourselves to it, but it's kind of a key one to understand because it's another envelope and it's another thing that's reacting to you playing a note and letting go of the note. It's that triggering of that envelope, but in that case, opening and closing the filter. So there are other places we can assign envelopes to, right? Pitch is a very common one. So if we're making drum sounds, a pitch envelope that's already connected to pitch, great. We're in operator. Let's look at that. If we look at operator here, we have a pitch envelope section. If we switch that on, we've got a dedicated section of an envelope, and we see attack, decay, release. There is sustain there as well. It's giving us an envelope that will react to the pitch of a note. So when we're playing a note on our keyboard, it can pitch that note up and down, reacting with an envelope. That's a powerful tool, especially if we're doing drum sounds. If we go to analog, analog has a pitch envelope. So if we click on oscillator 1, we've got this envelope down here, pitch, initial, time, right? And that can give us another envelope. If we're in wavetable, we've got 2 spare envelopes. We don't have a dedicated pitch envelope here, but we could assign one of those to the pitch. So we could see here, pitch in our matrix, and we could say, okay, envelope 3, you're going to be applying that envelope when we play a key on and off to the pitch. It's going to sound a bit weird till we maybe... So you can hear it bending. bring it down a little bit, the amount. Just a... Right, so that could be kind of cool. So I think this definitely deserves like a part two. We're sort of just scratching the surface. I wanted to reinforce this concept of like sitting in front of a VST or any synth, starting with subtractive, understanding harmonics are really important to have something to subtract from, that the filter is really important as a part of that. The waveform that starts the harmonics is important. Maybe you're stacking waveforms to get that, maybe using a triangle instead of a sine. Valuable lesson, as I said, don't use sines with filters unless you're creating harmonics on those sines, because they've got nothing to filter. You're just turning down the fundamental note. That's very important. And then after that, we're just on the tip of the surface in terms of all the different types of synthesis here. So then we break away from subtractive and we use wavetable synthesis, additive synthesis, bitimbral with the meld. We break away from that and we go into the locker of, okay, these synths can all do something else, create a whole new sound, and then we start looking at modulation next. So we can see we can apply envelopes to other locations other than just the filter and the amp. They can go to pitch, they could also go to resonance, they could also go to moving the wavetable around. So we got all sorts of stuff to unpack, but you've got now hopefully the kind of keys to, as I said, sitting in front of the synth and making something from it. So let's say, just as a last little sign off here, I'm going to take a basic analog here, just as an example. And I'm just going to show you something with the analog before we sign out today. And we're just going to, basically, I'm going to say, let's try and make a decent kick drum with the analog. Can we do that? Can we make a kick without any sort of effects to start with? We're just going to go for like an analog and make a 4 on the floor kick. So I'm going to turn off oscillator 2. I'm going to drop in some MIDI here, just a 4 on the floor kick drum. You know, maybe we give ourselves a ghost note for a little bit of spice. Let's turn off the front there. So obviously we're in a register at the moment that's very high because we're at C3 on the piano. So I'm going to move my MIDI notes down in this case. And I'm going to go for like a G0 kick. It's my favorite kind of kick drum type frequency. So there we are on G0. I don't want a sawtooth, so I want a sine wave. Get a nice clean sound. Let's just see what we've got on the master track. So I might juice it up a bit with the limiter so you guys can kind of hear it a bit better on the stream. So we've got a very sort of subby, low kind of, almost like a kick, but it's very undefined, right? So we're in analog, we're thinking about making a kick. We've got our oscillator, and I think the sine wave is a good place to start here for a kick drum because it's nice and clean and it's giving us our wave, simple wave, right? So if we do open the visualizer so you guys can see, we don't really need that. Probably the waveform is a bit more helpful, this guy here for a moment, right? So let's go to the amp envelope. Kick drum, we don't really need a lot of sustain. I think we can have that at 0. Right? If you bring in the decay, it'll be a very short kick. Almost like a click. Or we could have a more longer decay, like an 808 type kick. So if we were trying to make an 808, big 808 kick, we'd probably have that decay a bit longer. If we use the filter, we could be clever. The filter could give us a little bit of character here, because remembering that we've got a sine wave, and if we just bring the filter down, we're just going to turn our note down, right? So remembering that in this case, if we just use the filter like it is, we're just turning the fundamental down. But if we add a bit of resonance, hear the little click that I've made? I've kind of made a little bit of a transient there. And it's about the resonance. It's kind of a cool little trick that you can do when you're making drum sounds with synths, is you can use a little bit of the resonance just to boost the cutoff on the filter, and we can get a little bit of a transient. Okay, and also what I might do is I can change my filter type here. So I have one of these ones that are a bit more dirty. So we've got a sneaky little transient from that. Amp envelope is kind of working. We don't need a lot of release. little bit so we don't have a click. So just enough release until we don't get a click, right? So here, it's way too long. Here, it's giving us a click when the envelope re-triggers, so we're just going to smooth that out. And the attack, if we want sort of a more rounded analog kick, but I probably want, that's the one weakness I think with the analog as a kick. It already has 5 milliseconds of attack shaved off. It's not at 0, so I'd probably want in the future something to give this maybe a bit more transient. Some of the other synths allow me to get to 0 on the attack. I'm not sure the wavetable on the amp. Yeah, you can get to 0, right? So that's going to allow me to not have any rounding of the attacks. It's only a small amount, but it's enough to soften the transient a bit, right? So release maybe a little longer. But the key thing about this, it's just okay at the moment, right? There's no processing here. But what we want, actually, we could add some noise as well. So we could turn on the noise oscillator. And we could bring the color up and the volume down. Until we get, again, just a little bit of character from that, tiny amount that we'd notice if it wasn't there. But the real key to the operator kick drum idea here is going to be this pitch envelope. So now we're going to see what happens with the pitch envelope. So let's bring up the initial. There we go. And then bring in the time. Don't have to have the noise there if you want it nice and clean. It's kind of and no processing yet, no effects. So we could also change this kick a lot by putting audio effects after it, right? Let's turn the filter off, see if that's... Yeah, I think the filter's a good contribution, right? In this case, because of the resonance, remembering that I've said don't filter a sine wave, I'm filtering a sine wave here, but I've changed the filter character in the drive section, and I've also given this resonance that if we take that away, it still sounds okay because of the different filter type, but it definitely has more transient when we give it a bit of resonance. So you have this dial here where you can kind of dial that into what we want. And if we change the envelope amount, that also is quite nice because again, it's giving us some nice click and transient. So you can see here, I'm getting super nerdy and super detailed, but this is a nice exercise of making a kick from a synth here. And I'm applying all these things that I understand. The oscillator that's giving me the waveform, the amp envelope, the shape of that's giving me the release and the attack and the decay of a kick, and then this filter section, and then a little bit of noise if I wish, or that pitch envelope just made a difference. Medicinal Soul, this seems so pointless, doesn't sound any better than... Okay, so that could be true. What's the point? It's a great question. Well, what is the point? These are really good questions to touch on, actually. So the one, like it might seem like a silly thing, silly exercise to be doing. Well, first of all, it's good to kind of practice and learn these things. If you make sample packs or wish to make your own sounds, this is a place that you can kind of generate your own sounds, because once we've got the basics here, we can obviously change pitch and add effects and things and build like probably 10 or 15 of our own kicks. The main difference, my friend Medicinal Soul, is that when you're working with synthesized kicks, is tuning them to your track. It's very easy for me to understand the pitch and tuning of this kick to my track. I can make it fit my track very easily. Samples, many people are just dropping them in. If you've got a good ear and you can hear that kick fits inside your track, tuning wise, great. But if you want to tune your kicks to your track, synthesized kicks are a great option because they can do that very, very easy. But it's a good question, and absolutely it's your own personal taste, right, as to, you know, what's going on in that sense. Whether you want to spend the time doing this, but it's just showing you a demonstration of how you can build a sound using what we've looked at. And we can kind of see here, we've got a nice G0 here happening. It's exactly what I kind of wanted from how I've sort of set up this kick. And if I started to, for example, let's take this a bit further, let's put an audio track next door to it, right? And let's say we're going to route the analog in. But very valid question. As I said, it's mainly, if you haven't thought about it before, it's mainly about this concept of, like, as I said, working with samples. Of course, you can tune those and make those fit your track, but a lot of people forget and ignore that. And with synthesis, you actually have a lot more control over that. And the sort of next bit that we're going to do is, if we sort of just set this up to do a bit of recording, you know, we can then mess around with what we've got so far and make a few different kicks. And what we're doing is we're printing all of those right over here, and maybe we're making some interesting sort of sounds here, but we didn't even start as well to elevate this to the next level, which would be where you would begin to sort of customize this further by adding your own processing afterwards, you know. And so getting in here with things like the raw and the drum bus, and we can really create some kind of, let's get in here with a bit of a, start to add some sort of character. And I'd literally just kind of keep that running for a while, and I'm going to stop that now, but that would be kind of how I would potentially take this a bit further. I'll turn that back to a normal audio track now, no input. And if we sort of zoom in, particularly to those last ones, now that I've added the audio effect in there, you know, we've got these kind of interesting different kicks. And, you know, maybe this kick here is a new sample pack kick for your own personal music workflow, and you just chop that out and drop it in a drum rack, and there's, look, great kick over here. And you're really controlling everything about that kick as well in terms of its envelope shape again, like its attack, decay, and release. And you can see here, this is the one weakness of analog for me, as me using it as the kick creator, is that it has that 5 seconds of attack. So it gives me a more rounded analog attack than you would get with some of the other synths that the envelope triggers at 0. But we can easily, as I said, adjust that a little bit as well. But these are good looking kick drums, you know, and as I said, I would just go along and slice those up now. And what I was just doing with the raw, I would generally set myself up here with a few different effects that I like at the end of the analog, and go through trialing some of them out and recording like we just did. But great question. Why not discuss it, throw it around? What's the point? Well, yeah, perhaps try it out yourself and see. But yeah, it's the way you get on the pathway to starting making your own drum sounds instead of samples. And what are the advantages? Well, that's a good question to ask. And what it is that also, what we just had here, particularly with some of these, as I said, once I started adding the processing, that doesn't exist anywhere else other than on my computer right now. So that's the point about it, right? Does it sound better or inferior or worse? Who knows? But the point is that it's my own kick that I've kind of created with that workflow, and that's kind of the start maybe of how you might go about making more and more sounds: hi-hats, tom drums, kick drums, all sorts. All right, on that note, I'm going to call it a wrap for today. It's been good to have some questions, good to have some of you who did comment in there as we've been going along today, and I hope you have found it useful. I hope you have in the locker now just the bare minimum that when you pull up one of these synths from Ableton's locker, or you go to a friend's studio and you're sat in front of a hardware synth, where do I start? How can I begin making a sound on this? Well, that was the building blocks we unpacked today. Pigments we used, as I said, as a third-party one, because it does do a good job of giving us the visual connection of the envelopes. So brought that in to show you that. But future videos on this, if you'd like to see them, perhaps drop a comment below, let me know. But they would be then going into wavetable synthesis, FM synthesis, granular, making sounds with all those different types, operators, additive, FM, etc., and unpacking those. And then modulation, we've looked at only pitch envelope and filter envelope, tip of the surface, right? So modulation is a big part of all these synths in terms of getting things to move around and become dynamic, to do with the sound that you want to come out of the synth. So that's going to be a wrap from me. As always, I will put a link to a video at the end here that I would strongly suggest you watch following this one. If you've enjoyed this video as well and you're enjoying the content on the channel, do like, comment and subscribe. It helps a lot. You can also, if you wish, support the channel, grab us a coffee. There's a link in the description below. I will drop a link to grab that PDF that I created of my little chart of Ableton synths in the locker room and what each of them are capable of doing. I'll drop a link in the description. Also the oscilloscope from Max for Live. Stick that down in the description. And of course, as always, keep creating, keep making music, keep enjoying the journey on your way to making the music you want to make, finding your unique sound. These are the you know, as I said, for me, synthesis, top 3 keys to the front door to unlocking how to make your own complete sound, and not just relying on presets and things like that. Stepping away from that and getting your own sound out. Okay, take care of yourselves. Have a great rest of your weekends, and I will see you in the next live stream. Next Sunday, we should be back in action, as always, around 3 p.m. Central Eastern Standard Time. Take care. Have a fantastic rest of your weekend. Bye-bye. Ciao. Thank you, everybody. Ciao, ciao.